July 1943. The Eastern Front is ablaze. Hitler believes he can deliver a decisive blow to the Soviet Union by smashing a massive bulge in the Russian lines. This is Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, a clash so vast it will redefine armored warfare. But almost from the start, everything goes wrong. The Germans had planned meticulously. Operation Citadel, as it was called, aimed to encircle Soviet forces in the Kursk salient, a giant protrusion in the front lines. Hitler imagined a blitzkrieg perfected, panzer divisions slicing through the Soviet defenses, infantry and artillery following in perfect synchrony. Every officer, every tank, every soldier had a role. In theory, it was a masterpiece of military engineering. The Soviets, however, were ready. They had learned from previous defeats and fortified Kursk like a fortress. Mines covered every approach. Anti-tank guns were dug into every ridge. Artillery and machine gun nests created overlapping fields of fire, turning the salient into a deadly trap. Intelligence reports, including intercepted German communications, warned Soviet commanders exactly where the German thrust would occur. Kursk would not be easy to take. Hitler's forces were formidable. Hundreds of Tigers, Panthers, and Panzer IVs rolled toward Kursk, accompanied by mechanized infantry, artillery, and the Luftwaffe's bombing wings. Commanders expected speed and surprise to carry the day. But the more they advanced, the more the battlefield revealed its complexity. Every ridge, forest, and village became a potential death trap. Mines shredded tracks. Anti-tank fire knocked out armor before it could reach enemy positions. German soldiers began to feel the first hints of frustration. Soviet defenses were not only physical, they were psychological. Commanders had spent months preparing their troops for the German assault. Infantrymen, tank crews, and artillery units were coordinated like a giant machine. They were told to absorb the initial German attacks, fall back strategically, and then counterattack with overwhelming force. Patience and preparation gave the Soviets an edge that would prove crucial in the days to come. As the battle began, German tanks encountered a nightmare of obstacles. Mines ripped through treads, explosions hurled metal and earth into the air, and Soviet artillery targeted tanks before they could organize. Infantry followed tanks too slowly to capitalize on breakthroughs. Communication problems, supply delays, and the immense scale of the battlefield started to unravel even the best-laid German plans. Hitler's obsession with success compounded the problem. He demanded rapid advances, fearing that delays would squander Germany's opportunity to crush the Soviet Union. Field commanders, however, faced brutal realities. Terrain, weather, and a well-prepared enemy that refused to crumble. Friction between Hitler's expectations and frontline realities created tension and confusion, contributing to the unfolding disaster. Soviet intelligence had achieved a near-perfect picture of German intentions. Mines, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified positions funneled the German advance into kill zones. German commanders were forced to make difficult decisions under fire. Attack after attack stalled, armor was lost, and casualties mounted. The soldiers, trained to execute precision blitzkrieg maneuvers, found themselves trapped in a grinding, bloody battle of attrition. Air power, too, played a critical role. The Luftwaffe, intended to provide close support and break enemy lines, struggled against well-prepared Soviet air defenses. Dogfights raged above the salient, while ground forces below contended with artillery, mines, and hidden tanks. Coordination was nearly impossible at this scale. Every advantage Hitler expected was neutralized by preparation and sheer defensive strength. Kursk revealed fundamental weaknesses in German strategy. Blitzkrieg relied on speed, surprise, and concentrated force. At Kursk, speed was impossible because the Soviets anticipated the attack. Surprise was gone due to intelligence leaks. Concentrated force met fortified positions designed to channel attacks into ambushes. The German plan, brilliant on paper, began to collapse under the weight of reality. Meanwhile, Soviet counterattacks began to intensify. Fresh divisions, reserves hidden behind the salient, began striking the overextended German units. Armored battles erupted in villages, fields, and forests. The Soviets leveraged terrain, mines, and artillery to devastating effect. Every step forward for the Germans was met with fierce resistance, and every gain came at a tremendous cost. Despite early German confidence, losses mounted rapidly. Panthers and tigers, supposed to dominate the battlefield, were destroyed or immobilized. Supply lines were stretched to breaking point. Soldiers faced exhaustion, confusion, and the psychological strain of fighting a prepared, relentless enemy. Hitler's dream of a decisive victory slipped further away with every passing day. By the end of the first phase, it was clear that Kursk would not be a swift German triumph. The carefully plotted encirclement had failed. Momentum, the key to blitzkrieg, had been lost. German commanders realized that even if they pressed forward, they would face mounting resistance and a counterattack of unprecedented scale. Kursk was becoming not a victory, but a grinding test of endurance. Yet the battle was far from over. Both sides braced for the second wave, Soviet reserves ready to launch counteroffensives that would exploit German overextension. The stage was set for massive armored clashes that would define the future of the Eastern Front. Hitler's disaster at Kursk was not just a tactical failure. It was the beginning of a strategic turning point in the war. In the next part, we'll explore the massive tank clashes, air battles, and counterattacks that defined Kursk, showing how planning, preparation, and Soviet resilience turned the German offensive into a grinding nightmare. The morning of July 5, 1943, dawned hot and tense over the Kursk salient. The German offensive had begun, and the battlefield quickly became a chaotic hell of steel, fire, and smoke. Panzer divisions charged forward, expecting rapid breakthroughs, but the reality was far different. Mines tore through tracks, anti-tank guns fired relentlessly, and Soviet defenders waited patiently for the moment to strike. The first tank clashes were devastating. Tigers and Panthers, feared for their firepower, engaged Soviet T-34s in muddy fields and bombed out villages. The T-34 was smaller, faster, and more maneuverable than the massive German tanks, and Soviet crews had been drilled to exploit their speed and tactical flexibility. Every German advance was contested fiercely, and the concept of blitzkrieg, fast, decisive victory, was evaporating. The Luftwaffe tried to dominate the skies, but Soviet pilots were ready. Yak fighters intercepted German bombers, and dive bombers struggled to hit well-prepared positions. Anti-aircraft fire was dense and coordinated, making it extremely dangerous to fly low. For every German plane that succeeded, several were shot down or damaged. Air superiority, so crucial to Hitler's plan, was contested every moment of the battle. On the ground, German soldiers faced a nightmare of obstacles. Mines hidden under fields, roads, and even farmland exploded without warning, destroying tanks and injuring crews. Every hill and village was defended with overlapping fields of fire, machine guns, and artillery. Commanders tried to coordinate attacks, but communication lines were cut, radios jammed, and the battlefield was a mess of smoke, fire, and confusion. By the second day, the Germans had realized the scale of their miscalculation. Their panzer divisions, despite being heavily armored, could not punch through the Soviet fortifications. Each step forward cost tanks, men, and morale. Fuel and ammunition had to be delivered under constant fire, slowing movement even further. The soldiers were exhausted, the officers frustrated, and Hitler impatient. Meanwhile, Soviet reserves began moving into position for counterattacks. Fresh T-34 and KV-1 tanks rolled out from hidden depots, striking German flanks and rear positions. Engineers had dug concealed anti-tank obstacles that forced German armor into narrow kill zones. Every forward movement was met with deadly resistance. German commanders began to understand the grim reality. Kursk was not just a battle, it was a trap. The scale of tank combat at Kursk was unprecedented. Hundreds of tanks clashed in open fields, villages, and forests, firing relentlessly. Crews faced terrifying conditions: deafening cannon fire, smoke obscuring visibility, and the constant threat of mines or ambushes. The Germans had expected to dominate with superior armor and firepower, but the Soviets had turned defense into a science, exploiting every weakness and holding their ground with remarkable discipline. Artillery played a decisive role. Soviet guns were carefully placed to target roads, likely tank approaches, and choke points. Every tank destroyed was a blow to morale and momentum. German artillery could fire back, but the Soviets had planned to absorb the initial attacks and then counterstrike. By mid-July, German advances had slowed to a crawl. Commanders faced the grim truth. Even their most advanced weapons could not overcome the prepared defenses. Air battles were equally intense. The Luftwaffe tried to suppress Soviet artillery and attack tank concentrations, but Soviet pilots were numerous, skilled, and coordinated. Dogfights raged across the skies, while bombers and fighters attempted risky low-level attacks. German losses mounted. The very weapon Hitler relied on to ensure a rapid victory was being neutralized, leaving his forces exposed and vulnerable. In the villages and forests, infantry battles were brutal. German soldiers attempted to secure positions to allow tanks to advance, but every village was defended with machine guns, anti-tank weapons, and prepared fields of fire. Casualties mounted, and morale dropped. The combination of terrain, fortifications, and coordinated Soviet defense transformed what should have been a rapid assault into a grinding, attritional battle. Hitler grew increasingly frustrated. Orders for faster advances and bolder attacks clashed with the reality of exhausted troops, destroyed armor, and blocked supply lines. Commanders in the field struggled to explain why progress was impossible, but Hitler's insistence on offensive action kept pushing units into deadly zones. Every delay or setback was viewed as disobedience or incompetence, adding pressure and tension at every level. By the third week of July, German forces were overextended. The initial push had stalled, losses were heavy, and the Soviets were preparing their massive counteroffensive. Mines, destroyed bridges, and disrupted supply lines made it difficult to regroup. German soldiers began to realize that Kursk was not a victory waiting to happen. It was a battlefield that demanded attrition, endurance, and adaptation, none of which the German High Command had adequately planned for. The turning point was approaching. Soviet artillery, tanks, and infantry launched coordinated attacks on German flanks. The very forces that had absorbed the initial German assaults now struck back with overwhelming power. German tanks, already slowed by mines and obstacles, were caught in crossfire. Supply shortages limited repair and resupply. By late July, it was clear that the German offensive had failed. Kursk, intended to be a decisive victory, was becoming a disaster. In the next part, we'll explore the Soviet counteroffensives, the massive losses on both sides, and how Kursk marked a turning point on the Eastern Front, showing why this battle became Hitler's strategic disaster. By late July 1943, the tide at Kursk was shifting. German forces, exhausted and overextended, faced a counteroffensive of staggering scale. The Soviets had been patient, allowing the Germans to attack into a trap of fortifications, mines, and prepared kill zones. Now, the Red Army unleashed everything they had held in reserve. Soviet tanks surged forward in waves. T-34s and KV-1s, supported by artillery and infantry, struck German flanks and rear positions. Mines and destroyed roads slowed German armor, leaving vehicles vulnerable to well-aimed Soviet fire. Every German advance, once expected to be unstoppable, was now met with overwhelming force. Momentum had shifted, and the Germans were on the defensive. The Luftwaffe, which had been expected to dominate the skies and support ground forces, found itself overstretched. Soviet air forces attacked German supply lines, convoys, and artillery positions. Dogfights erupted over forests and open fields, while German ground units struggled to advance under constant fire from both air and ground. Air superiority, critical for the Blitzkrieg, had effectively vanished. German commanders tried to reorganize, but logistical nightmares hampered every effort. Fuel shortages grounded some tanks, while artillery ammunition ran low. Mines and obstacles littered the battlefield, slowing movements to a crawl. Soldiers on the front lines faced exhaustion, confusion, and the psychological weight of knowing the enemy had anticipated their every move. In villages across the salient, Soviet infantry struck with precision. Anti-tank weapons and machine guns were placed in overlapping fields of fire. German soldiers advancing into these villages were ambushed repeatedly, their armor destroyed, and their morale plummeted. Even the formidable Tiger and Panther tanks, symbols of German might, were vulnerable in close quarters fighting against prepared defenses. Artillery exchanges were relentless. Soviet guns, often hidden or camouflaged, pounded German positions, while counter-battery fire limited German artillery effectiveness. Every move forward by the Germans was met with a storm of steel and fire. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the Germans, already overextended and stretched thin, could not replace their losses fast enough. The scale of the Soviet counteroffensive was staggering. Entire divisions struck at multiple points simultaneously. Mines funneled German armor into predictable paths where artillery and tank fire awaited. Infantry, tanks, and artillery operated in precise coordination. The Soviets had turned the Kursk salient into a weapon itself, using its geography, fortifications, and patience to devastating effect. By early August, the German offensive had ground to a halt. The original objectives of encirclement and decisive victory were abandoned. Hitler, frustrated and desperate, pressed for renewed attacks, but field commanders understood the futility. German forces had lost hundreds of tanks, tens of thousands of soldiers, and critical momentum. The Red Army was not only holding its ground, but beginning to push back. The psychological impact on German troops was immense. Soldiers who had trained for rapid armored breakthroughs found themselves trapped in slow, attritional battles. Exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty weighed heavily. Even elite panzer divisions, considered the pride of the Wehrmacht, could not overcome the combination of Soviet preparation, terrain, and sheer numbers. Meanwhile, Soviet forces consolidated their gains and began exploiting weaknesses. Counterattacks were launched to encircle overextended German units. Mines and obstacles, combined with artillery barrages, left German positions fragmented. Commanders struggled to maintain cohesion under relentless pressure. Kursk, intended as a German victory, was slipping into disaster. Casualty figures were staggering. Estimates suggest the Germans lost nearly 200,000 soldiers and hundreds of tanks, while Soviet losses, though higher in raw numbers, were mitigated by reserves and production. The balance of armored warfare on the Eastern Front was shifting. Kursk proved that the Wehrmacht could no longer rely on blitzkrieg to secure decisive victories. The failure of Operation Citadel marked a strategic turning point. Hitler's insistence on attacking a prepared, fortified position had backfired spectacularly. The Red Army had learned, adapted, and executed a plan that neutralized German strengths and exploited their weaknesses. Kursk demonstrated that preparation, intelligence, and coordination could overcome even technologically superior forces. For historians, Kursk is more than a tank battle. It's a case study in strategy, planning, and the limits of aggression. German arrogance, overconfidence, and Hitler's obsession with decisive victories collided with Soviet preparation and patience. The result was one of the largest and most consequential battles of the war, reshaping the Eastern Front and signaling a shift in momentum that Germany could not recover from. The battle also showcased human resilience and ingenuity. Soviet engineers, soldiers, and commanders had built an almost impenetrable defense, coordinating artillery, tanks, and infantry with astonishing precision. German forces, while skilled and heavily armed, were stretched to the breaking point. Kursk became a testament to preparation over brute force, patience over impulsive aggression, and strategy over obsession. As the German army retreated, the Red Army advanced. The Kursk salient gradually shrank under relentless pressure. Villages, ridges, and river crossings that had been fiercely contested were reclaimed, often after weeks of bitter fighting. German troops, demoralized and battered, were forced to abandon positions they had initially hoped to hold, leaving Kursk as a symbol of strategic failure for Hitler. In the final analysis, Kursk proved that even the most formidable forces can be defeated by preparation, intelligence, and strategic patience. Hitler's disaster was not just a tactical failure, it was a psychological and operational collapse, marking the beginning of a sustained Soviet advance that would carry all the way to Berlin. In the next part, we'll explore the aftermath of Kursk, lessons learned, and how this battle reshaped the Eastern Front, showing the long-term impact on Germany, the Soviets, and the overall outcome of World War II. By August 1943, the smoke of Kursk was clearing, leaving behind devastation and a stark reality. Germany had suffered a major defeat. Operation Citadel, Hitler's plan for a decisive victory, had failed. The Wehrmacht had lost hundreds of tanks, tens of thousands of soldiers, and crucial momentum on the Eastern Front. For Hitler, it was more than a tactical setback, it was a strategic disaster. The Soviets, meanwhile, emerged stronger. Their defense had not only absorbed the German offensive, but had inflicted irreparable damage. Armored divisions that had been expected to sweep aside Soviet defenses were decimated or forced to retreat. Infantry had endured intense bombardments and close-quarter battles, but the Red Army's planning, reserves, and coordination had turned Kursk into a triumph of preparation over brute force. The aftermath of Kursk reshaped the Eastern Front. German forces could no longer launch large-scale offensives with the confidence that had carried them from France to Moscow. The Wehrmacht had been forced onto the defensive, marking a turning point in the war. From this point forward, the Soviets held the initiative, pushing German forces steadily back toward Berlin over the next 2 years. Kursk had shifted the momentum irrevocably. Strategically, Kursk highlighted the limits of Hitler's approach to war. Overconfidence, obsession with decisive victories, and underestimation of enemy capabilities had led to catastrophic losses. Blitzkrieg, which had seemed unstoppable in Western Europe, could not overcome deeply prepared, well-coordinated defenses. Logistics, intelligence, and terrain mattered as much as tanks and firepower, and at Kursk, they tipped the scales decisively. For the soldiers, the lessons were bitter but clear. German troops experienced the consequences of overextension and poor planning firsthand. Exhausted panzer crews and infantrymen saw tanks immobilized by mines, ambushed by artillery, and destroyed by superior numbers. Morale suffered as the scale of failure became apparent, and trust in leadership was strained by Hitler's insistence on pressing attacks despite the unfolding disaster. Soviet soldiers, on the other hand, gained confidence. Their patience, discipline, and preparation had been rewarded with a monumental victory. They proved that methodical planning and strategic depth could overcome technologically advanced and experienced opponents. Kursk became a defining moment in the Red Army's transformation into a formidable modern fighting force capable of sustaining and exploiting large-scale offensives. The human cost of Kursk was immense. Estimates suggest over 200,000 German casualties and up to 300,000 Soviet casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing. Hundreds of tanks were destroyed or disabled. Cities, villages, and farmland were leveled. Survivors on both sides were left with the trauma of the most intense tank battle in history, a conflict of unimaginable scale, firepower, and destruction. Kursk also influenced future military thinking. Armored warfare was forever changed by the lessons learned. Prepared defenses, intelligence gathering, reserves, and coordination between infantry, artillery, and armor became essential. The myth of unstoppable blitzkrieg was shattered, replaced by a more complex understanding of combined arms warfare. Military historians study Kursk not only for its scale, but for its enduring lessons in strategy, planning, and the cost of hubris. For Hitler, the failure at Kursk compounded earlier mistakes. It weakened the Wehrmacht, diminished German morale, and accelerated the shift of initiative to the Soviets. Strategic opportunities were lost, and the dream of crushing the Soviet Union in a single blow evaporated. Kursk was a clear example of how ambition, arrogance, and underestimation of the enemy could turn a meticulously planned offensive into a disaster. The battle's legacy is still studied today. Kursk remains a symbol of preparation over speed, intelligence over aggression, and patience over impulsive action. It reminds us that even the most technologically advanced forces can be defeated if they misjudge the enemy and ignore the realities of terrain, logistics, and strategy. The battle is a cautionary tale about overreach and the human cost of ambition gone unchecked. Even decades later, historians, wargamers, and military enthusiasts examine Kursk for insights. Scale models, simulations, and battlefield tour explore how tanks, infantry, and artillery interacted on this colossal stage. The psychological, strategic, and operational lessons of Kursk continue to inform military thinking, teaching that preparation, coordination, and patience can overcome even seemingly superior forces. Kursk also humanizes the scale of World War II. The battle wasn't just about tanks and generals. It was about thousands of individuals enduring unimaginable conditions. Tank crews trapped under fire, infantry advancing through minefields, pilots fighting for air superiority in constant danger. The battle's scale highlights the cost of strategy, the price of hubris, and the resilience of those on the front lines. In the end, Hitler's disaster at Kursk was more than a failed offensive. It was the moment when the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front definitively shifted to the Soviets. It was a clash of preparation versus ambition, patience versus hubris, and planning versus overconfidence. Kursk remains one of the most studied, analyzed, and dramatic battles in history because of its lessons, scale, and consequences. The Battle of Kursk proves that even the best-laid plans can fail when overconfidence meets preparation. The German army, once considered unstoppable, was checked and then rolled back by a combination of foresight, resilience, and strategic depth. Kursk reminds us that history is shaped not only by technology and strength, but by intelligence, patience, and the ability to adapt to the enemy. If you want to explore another incredible story of ambition, disaster, and warfare that changed history, watch the next video. It's another example of how strategy and preparation can determine the fate of nations.